Hello everyone, my name is Ira Gamboa, and today I would like to discuss and present my 6.2 discussion assignment, a PowerPoint presentation for Supply Chain Logistic Management 446, Global Logistics and Transportation. How did the Cuban trade embargo impact the United States? Abstract. What is the Cuban trade embargo? How does it affect the U.S. tourism industry, U.S. industries, U.S. economy, and GDP? Who benefits from keeping the embargo and from lifting it? What is the role of U.S. taxpayers in this conflict? What is the effect to both countries before, during, and after? Agenda. Today I would like to discuss about the Cuban trade embargo, how it affects the U.S. tourism, the government actions and its cost for taxpayers, U.S. industries and the effect of the Cuban trade embargo, and the U.S. economy and GDP. What is Cuban trade embargo? An embargo is a Spanish word that means hindrance or obstruction. Thus, the Cuban trade embargo is a trading ban or prohibition of commerce and trade against Cuba. Some countries embargoed by the United States are Afghanistan, Belarus, Bolivia, Cambodia, China, Crimea, Cuba, Eritrea, North Korea, Iran, Syria, and more. However, the Cuban trade embargo is controversial due to Cuba's poor human rights record. In July 1960, the Cuban government nationalized all U.S. businesses without compensation. In October the same year, President Dwight Eisenhower's State Department imposed a Cuban trade embargo. The U.S. embargo against Cuba is aimed to prevent American business and businesses under U.S. law or majority owned by American citizens from conducting trade with Cuban interests. It is the most ongoing trade embargo in modern history. The original embargo covered all U.S. ports except medicine and some foods. On February 1962, President John F. Kennedy made a Cuban trade embargo permanent. How the trade embargo affects the U.S. tourism industry. In 1993, the Cuban government legalized the U.S. Dollar being used by the citizens of Cuba. This move began a dual currency system on the island where both U.S. dollar and Cuban peso were acceptable forms of currency. The Cuban trade embargo lasted 56 years from 1960 to 2016. It cost the tourism industry 38 billion US dollar due to travel restriction, sales promotion restrictions, sanctions, international law, and travel industry cruise ship restriction. Even the Twitter communication from Xinhua News Agency thread shows that everyone knows how the communism and embargo affected the US and Cuban tourism industries with all the conflicts. The shipping, tourism, and cruise ship passengers were welcome in Cuba in 2016 when embargo was lifted by then US President Barack Obama. The passengers signed up for shore excursion, visiting nightclubs, landmarks, rivers, and beautiful beaches to start global logistics and transportation and the rebirth of the tourism industry in Cuba. However, in June 2019, President Trump announced restriction canceling all the stops to Cuba, rerouting the ships on the go. The U.S. cruise ship airlines industry lost $712 million in annual revenue due to the travel restrictions. Concept of the government actions and the cost of the Cuban trade embargo to the U.S. taxpayers. According to Margot Pepper of Dollar and Cents, quote, the cost of the embargo, the 47-year-old blockade now costs the United States far more than it cost Cuba, end quote. The original justification of the Cuban trade embargo was Cuba's seizing some 1.8 billion U.S.-owned properties. However, Cubans argued that the U.S. controlled 70% of the Cuban land and one-third of the Cuba primary industry. Since the U.S. took control of Cuba in the 1950s, Cubans have lived in small shacks or homeless. Pepper added that, quote, 80% of Havana suffered from hunger and unemployment, end quote. Given the economic meltdown, U.S. public opinion is turning against the embargo today. The embargo is costing U.S. taxpayers more than the Cubans. The cost of the Cuban trade embargo is $1.2 billion per year paid by the U.S. taxpayers, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The CPF estimates $4.84 billion annually in lost sales and export. In comparison, the Cuban government losing $685 million annually due to the embargo. Therefore, the Cuban trade embargo cost the United States up to $4.155 billion more than it cost Cuba. An addition of $27 million each year spent by the U.S. government are from the U.S. taxpayers' money and is used to broadcast radio and TV mart. The Cuban government, however, successfully blocked the signals of this largely futile propaganda. However, according to the Council of Hemispheric Affairs, U.S. taxpayers still pays for the $500 million over the last 20 years. The embargo stopped U.S. citizens by accessing Cuban medical breakthrough. Cuba developed the first meningitis B vaccine, a preservative for unrefrigerated milk, PPG, Simavax, EGFN against lung cancer, and more. According to the researchers of Johns Hopkins, U.S. businesses lost over $30 billion in trade over the first 30 years of the embargo. Regardless of the 56 years of the Cuban trade embargo, the socialist island was able to provide citizens top-notch health care, free university to graduate school education, plus subsidized food and utilities. In the U.S., 56 years of Cuban trade embargo funded by the U.S. taxpayers resulted to 36.2 million going hungry and 47 million lacking health coverage. The 1960 urban reform law successfully helped the Cubans and Cuban citizens. Today, there's hardly any homeless family in Cuba, and 85% of the Cubans own their own home and pay no property tax. The mortgage cannot exceed 10% of combined household income, making home ownership a reality in the Cuban's family. The unemployment rate in Cuba is 1.85 compared to 7.65% in the U.S. Comparison continued by looking at the 99.8 adult literacy rate in Cuba compared to 97% in the U.S. How did the U.S. industries affected by lifting the embargo? In March 2016, Barack Obama lifted the embargo and restored diplomatic ties with Cuba. In 2016, the first commercial flight between the United States and Cuba was reinstated. It was announced a month after that the 6 airlines permitted to offer flights to Cuba are the American Frontier, JetBlue, Silver Airways, Southwest, and Sun Country. The flights from the 5 U.S. cities to 9 cities in Cuba besides Havana continue. The agreement between the U.S. aviation industries and the Cuba allows 20 flights daily, which is a positive note for the U.S. industries. Fidel Castro died at age 90 in November of the same year. President Clinton created the wet foot, dry foot policy in 1995. Policy aimed to allow most Cuban migrants who reach the U.S. soil to stay and become legal permanent residents after 1 year. After intercepted at sea, all those that are intercepted at sea were sent back to Cuba. By lifting the 1960 Cuban trade embargo in 2016, it ends the 20-year-old wet foot, dry foot policy as well. The growth of the U.S. Aviation industry in Cuba was short-lived and faced political uncertainty a year after lifting the embargo. As per Weiss Haynes in 2017 explains, quote, restricting the network of aviation and access to Cuba would be a bad news for aviation, end quote. In the middle of 2016, some smaller carriers, namely Frontier Airlines, Silver Airways and Spirit Airlines pulled out of Cuba. The larger U.S. carriers have cut back on flights to smaller Cuban cities and focused all their services on the flights to and from Havana. Pending the administration review is the request of increasing frequency in the various Havana routes by American Airlines, Delta Airlines, United Airlines, Southwest Airlines, and JetBlue have all requested increased frequency on different Havana routes. U.S. cruise operator and airlines lost $712 million in annual revenue due to the travel restrictions to Cuba. How did lifting the embargo impact the U.S. economy and GDP? President Donald J. Trump implemented the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act in 2018, allowing the U.S. citizens to sue the companies that used the properties confiscated by the Cuban government after 1959, which is the last nail in the coffin, resulting in the implementation of the Cuban trade embargo. The Title III of the Helms-Burton Act scares investors to Cuba by allowing U.S. citizens to sue any person, company, entities that traffic properties confiscated by the Castro regime. Some affected by this third generation of Title III suits are Herrero de Roberto Gomez Cabrera LLC versus Tech Resources Ltd. By trafficking in confiscated mines from at least 1994 to 2009. And the list goes on. Still in 2019, even with embargo lifted, the Trump administration ended the group people-to-people authorization for U.S. travelers. The U.S. economy and GDP was impacted by the prohibition of cruise ships and other passenger vessels from traveling to Cuba. The administration bans most U.S. commercial flights to Cuba except Havana to add the already hurting economy. Canceling flights and cruise ship itineraries greatly affected the U.S. economy and GDP. In 2020, the Cuban government will allow the U.S. dollars only on some government-run stores and eliminate the 10% tax on U.S. dollars. In October 2020, the U.S. prohibited Cuba remittance, resulting in the Western Union closing 407 money transfer locations across Cuba. In 2021, the outgoing President Donald J. Trump administration reinstated the Cuba to the U.S. Department list of sponsors of terrorism. The reason mainly is because the Cuban government refused to extradite 10 leaders of Colombia's National Liberation Army. According to the U.S.-Cuba Relations Timeline, Congressional Digest on February 5, 2021, Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee introduced the U.S.-Cuba Trade Act of 2021 to repeal the outdated sanction on Cuba and normalize the trade relations of USA with Cuba. Senator Ron Wyden explained our nation's embargo to Cuba is an artifact from 1960. To continue this outdated harmful policy of isolation would be a failure of American leadership. While President Trump increased tension with Cuba during the disastrous time in office, I am optimistic that President Biden's new diplomatic course, according to Senator Wyden. He added, quote, regardless, Congress has a moral economic obligation to the American people to improve U.S.-Cuban relations as swiftly and safely as possible, end quote. In July 2021, thousands of Cubans protested due to the scarcity of food, medicine, fuel, and other essential items, and demanded freedom, criticizing the communist government. The Biden administration condemns the Cuban government's unacceptable response to the protests and supports people's right to demonstrate peacefully. In early 2022, the U.S. Embassy of Havana announced staffing increase to process U.S. visas for the Cuban citizens. In May 2022, the Biden administration lifted more restrictions on travel and remittance to Cuba. It means restoring the U.S. flights and airport other than Havana, removing the 1,000 quarterly limit on family remittances, and reinstating the Cuban family reunification parole program. Research analysis. What did you find out? Cuba had a very long and rich history with the United States. When the 13th North American colonies rebelled against Great Britain in 775, the increased commerce between newly independent nation and Cuba was encouraged. In 1818, Spain opened Cuban ports for the U.S. and the international trade. The effort to free Cuba from Spain involved American General Narciso Lopez executed for the cause. The U.S. hoisted the first Cuban flag designed by Narciso Lopez in New York City. The history reflects that the U.S. has been trying to look after the best interests of Cuba since 1775. Ostend Manifesto, a secret document of the U.S. diplomats, proposed to purchase Cuba from Spain for $130 million in 1854. However, Spain didn't accept the offer. In February 1898, the U.S. declared war against Spain when the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. By August of the same year, Spanish-American War ended. Spain gave up control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and Guam in what is known as the Treaty of Paris. By January 1, 1899, the U.S. commences the formal military occupation of Cuba. Then, on May 20, 1902, the U.S. ended the military occupation of Cuba and formally inaugurated the Cuban Republic. The United States of America and Cuba signed 3 treaties, namely the Permanent Treaty, the Reciprocity Treaties, and the Cuba to lease the sites of Bahia, Honda, and the Guantanamo Bay to the United States for naval construction. In conclusion, there is hope that the U.S.-Cuba Trade Act of 2021 can repeal the significant statutes of the codify and sanction against Cuba, also known as the disastrous 1960 Cuban trade embargo. Removal of the legal barriers include the Helms-Burton Act and the Cuban Democracy Act, plus the other prohibitions that affect the U.S.-Cuba trades, investment, and travel tourism industry. There is hope to establish a normal trade relation with Cuba. Only time can tell if the damage done by the Cuban trade embargo in 1960 can heal the U.S.-Cuba Trade Act of 2021. The aim is to repair the two countries' relationship and help the citizens have a better chance of international trade, a thriving tourism industry, and a healthy global logistics and transportation industry. It is essential to be optimistic when looking at the future, but be mindful of making sure that the history does not repeat itself. Here you can see my reference list. Thank you everyone for being such a gracious audience. Have a good day. I'll be happy to answer any questions for me.